Offseason. I'm your host, Cassie Carlson, and we have a great show today with two powerhouse guests. It's an all-female show, which I love because it is Women's History Month, the month of March. And this is my good friend, Courtney Cronin from ESPN. She is in studio with us to talk all things free agency. And then later in the show, we'll hear from Bears player personnel coordinator Ashton Washington, who is the first full-time female scout in Bears history. She is a superstar. So, Courtney, thanks for coming on the show. I'm excited to talk to you about free agency. We were both up at Hallis Hall last week. They're on Wednesday meeting some of the new guys, and especially two of the interior offensive linemen. I want to go back to 2 weeks ago. You start hearing about the trades, Jonah Jackson, Joe Thuney, and then they bring in Drew Dahlman in free agency. What were your reactions from seeing that the Bears could actually go out there and overhaul the interior of the offensive line, and then hearing them talk?
Yeah, Ben Johnson put his money where his mouth is. He said at the Combine when I asked him, is it possible to flip an entire part of an offensive line? A big portion of that unit in one offseason. He said, yeah, Carolina did it last year. There's other examples. And within a matter of 6 days, the Bears were able to do it with the Jonah Jackson trade, then Joe Thuney in less than about 15, 16 hours, and then getting the top center in free agency in Drew Dahlman. And I think the priorities were so clear for free agency for Ryan Poles. That was the weak link. Caleb Williams took 68 sacks. Obviously, not all 68 sacks were on the quarterback. Not all were on the offensive line. But there is a big portion of this offensive line that was the weakness, and that was where the pressure was coming from. The three techniques, defensive tackles in this league, specifically in the NFC North, they're big, they're ferocious pass rushers, and they just weren't getting it done up front in Chicago the last couple of years. So they needed to flip that. So to be able to go after, or first and foremost, survey the guard landscape, realize, do we really want to be overpaying for guards that we probably wouldn't be grading all that high, but they're the only ones available in free agency? The answer clearly for Chicago was no. So they decided to comb the landscape, find out who was available for a trade, who maybe knew the system, like a Jonah Jackson, who was drafted by Detroit, was there for the first 4 years of his career, overlapped with Ben Johnson. And while Joe Thuney only had 1 year of overlap with Ryan Poles in Kansas City, he's the top guard in the NFL. Anytime a team is like, this guy's available for a trade, you're going to make that call. So I think it was a wise strategy to follow when the weakness was so glaring that they couldn't get it wrong, really, if they were going about their priorities the right way. And, hearing from everybody last week up at Hallis Hall, there's a draw here. There's a common thread. While the two guys who were traded to Chicago didn't necessarily have a say in where they were going, per se, playing with a young quarterback who has a promising upward trajectory is a big draw, and that's certainly one of the reasons why Drew Dahlman wanted to be in Chicago.
Yeah, you look at back when Ryan Poles came in here, it's hard to bring in free agents and convince them to want to play in a city when you're going through a full rebuild, but this isn't that. Yeah. And Ben Johnson said when he was hired, part of the reason he wanted this job is because this roster is right where it needs to be, a few pieces away from being able to compete and hopefully go into the postseason. So that was why this job was partially attractive to him. And then, of course, you have a quarterback who you see with a very high trajectory over the next handful of years. Yep. What do you think was a bigger draw? Is it Ben Johnson completing the full picture that now they have a head coach that has a good reputation in the league? He has explosive offenses that they're hoping he can translate to a new team? Or is it Caleb Williams, the quarterback that everyone thinks can be the next end-all be-all?
And you're getting defensive players to talk about Caleb Williams. Yeah. Grady Jarrett had mentioned that because he had only a couple of hours last Monday to figure out where he was going. And, quarterback who is in year 2 is going to be probably who you take versus somebody who might be a more polished product, but what their ceiling is. But even Grady Jarrett is the one who said, hey, he's going to be with a guy like Ben Johnson who's going to have a chance to mold him into his offensive system and get the most out of him. So I think for that answer, I'd say Ben Johnson. The scheme itself, from what we saw in Detroit, the run game alone is so multiple. So you need smart offensive linemen to be able to execute a lot of that, especially when it comes down to the center position. He was asked, is there a common thread that you look for in interior offensive linemen? You're looking for smart, dependable players.
Dirty, too, he said.
Dirty. He had a lot of fun adjectives for this, but the intelligence factor, you got to be able to know what your assignment is, all the different gaps you might be responsible for, and execute it to the highest of your ability. And, the strength that Drew Dahlman has around him. He's got somebody who's 6'5" in Joe Thuney, 6'4" in Jonah Jackson, big, strong guards that are going to help him up front. That's the fit. That's, if you go take a look at what Detroit's offensive line looked like, that follows that model. So I think what Ben Johnson brings to the table, and Ryan Poles even talked about this, with guys are excited because they get to be in the prospect of an offense that can put up 30 or 40 points a game. That's at least what he did in Detroit. We don't know if that's going to happen right away in Chicago. There's probably a lot of work to be done to get there, but you have somebody who's, considered the offensive guru, who has the ingenuity within this scheme to make it very multiple. And I think that is going to be a big draw for a lot of players in their excitement factor of what the Chicago Bears offense could be in 2025.
Well, and you know that Ben Johnson, coming from Detroit, who had one of the best offensive lines in the league, is going to try to bring that to wherever he was to go, because that allowed them to do all the things that he could do. It was an interesting note that Joe Thuney mentioned, because I asked him about working with someone like Creed Humphrey and Trey Smith and being on that interior of the offensive line with the Chiefs, and he said they all came in at the same time too, and he thought that played a big part as to why they became one of the best offensive lines in the league in Kansas City. So having all three of them coming in at the same time, I think might play to the larger benefit of this team. And then we'll see what happens, obviously, with the left tackle position, whether or not it's Braxton Jones, Cronin, whether they go out in the draft, which I wouldn't be personally surprised if they just load up on the offensive line. An interesting thing that people were curious about is where Jonah Jackson is going to play, because his best seasons came at left guard in Detroit, and then he moved around the line when he was in LA. Some weird circumstances with injuries and such, and being left out of the rotation on the offensive line, essentially. Surprised that they're putting him there and having Joe Thuney. It's like a weird question, because Joe Thuney is also best at left guard and one of the best, but to move Jonah Jackson to a new position, were you surprised by that decision at all?
Well, we really need to find out how this order went about, because Jonah Jackson was traded for on a Tuesday, and then the next day they bring in Joe Thuney, and Jonah Jackson was working out, and he said that a teammate told him, oh, you guys got Joe Thuney too. So I'm sure he probably thought initially he was going to be playing left guard in Chicago. He started 40 games for Ben Johnson at that position when Ben Johnson was the offensive coordinator. Clearly it's where he's most comfortable, but he also did point to playing right guard. His first start with the Lions came in Chicago all those years ago. I think the big thing that we look at what happened last year, is it an outlier, or is it more of what to expect from Jonah Jackson at this point in his career? He had the injury. He said that was an injury that was relayed to him like a freak accident, something that they typically only see in car wrecks, what happened in his shoulder during training camp. He starts 4 games, he's, put on injured reserve, he's trying to come back, but then he gets benched. I just think it was playing out of position that put him in a really tough spot, because he not only played left guard, right guard, he played a little bit of center too. That's one thing that Bears fans can be excited about with this offensive line.
There's no question.
Unlike years past, we don't have a converted guard playing center. You have a true center playing center, and I know it sounds simple in theory. They cross-train all of those guys on the interior because they have to due to injury, but to have a true center playing center, having your guards play guard, it's a novel concept, but I promise you it works more times than not.
I love it. Ryan Poles mentioned getting pressure from the interior of the defensive line at the combine and how that frees up pass rushers. Montez Sweat, you're hoping you get a better, more productive season from him. You paid him, $98 million after trading for him. Is Dayo Odeyingbo, they're hoping he hasn't reached his potential yet, only 25 years old. But even if the production doesn't increase to what they're hoping, if he frees up Montez Sweat, is that worth it in itself?
I don't think they're having an expectation that he comes in here and hits double-digit sacks right away. But the fact that you mentioned, he's 25. He'll be 26 when he plays this season. He's got a lot of football left in the tank. They're betting on the upside. They're betting that he's going to be a high-ceiling player for this team. And what that does for Montez Sweat, to be able to have somebody that you fear, somebody that you game plan for on the other side of the defensive line, that should take away, at least in theory, the chips, the double teams, all the stuff that Montez Sweat had to deal with, all the added attention that only led him to 5.5 sacks last year. So this is as much as, much of an investment on the entire defensive line, but speaking to Montez specifically, you're right. They did pay him $98 million. He's the highest paid player on this roster. They need that production to manifest itself like it did in only a handful of games when he was traded here in 2023.
How valuable would the leadership in the locker be for guys like Joe Thuney and Grady Jarrett to step in there, have experience, know what it looks like to win, and be able to share the steps that need to be taken and use the right words to the locker room this next season?
I think it's interesting that last year they had 8 captains
because they had none, no
from
leaders,
the offensive line or defensive line. To me, that's a big problem. You've got to have your players who are the no-nonsense type, the players that you fall in line behind. They didn't have that up front. There is something to be said about guys in the trenches carrying that mindset and mentality that others will follow by. Joe Thuney's resume speaks for itself. I mean, the guy protected Tom Brady. He protected Patrick Mahomes. He's coming off back-to-back all-pro seasons. He's got 4 Super Bowl rings. If I'm Braxton Jones, if I'm Darnell Wright, if I'm any of these players, I'm like, I want to be like him. I want to fall in line, and I want to learn how to do it the way that he does, because at 32 years old, he's the best guard in the league still. And he's got more football left in the tank, so much so that the Bears felt necessary to trade for him. That's a sign of a culture shift, I think, that's going to take place on the offensive line. And then for someone like Grady Jarrett, who was with one team for 10 seasons, got like a personal note for him, from the owner of the Falcons, Arthur Blank, thanking him for his time with the organization, thanking him for his contributions to the Falcons, to the city. Not every player gets that. So I think for a leadership role, he will clearly be the alpha along that offensive line. Now, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing if you're someone like Montez Sweat, who wants to lead by example, and other players who are learning, what is my leadership style? What is the role that I should play here? To have somebody who's done it for so long and seen players come in and out and still been that consistent force like he was in Atlanta, I think that's a very good thing for the Chicago Bears defense.
The Bears have the extra OTAs in early April because of the new coaching staff, and Ben Johnson said something that I was like, every time he speaks, I forget how intense he is. Like, he has very direct messaging to, I think, the players. That's who he's trying to get it out to, that nothing is going to be easy, that expect to work hard, the expectations are higher than ever. It's kind of similar to when he told the players during his introductory press conference that, like, this is not meant to be easy and get ready to work. From what you've gathered, talking to other reporters, other sources, how intense of a coach is Ben Johnson? I guess we'll only know as an offensive coordinator, but how you expect that to translate as a head coach?
It is interesting because you don't have the body of work, because he has only been an offensive coordinator. That's his highest level of coaching in the NFL. And you can gather some of it just from the moxie he shows in calling all of these trick plays. He did it against the Bears with Stumblebum, and he loved to talk about that in his introductory press conference, and some of the players mentioned it. But I do think on top of, the window dressing and the flash and all of that, there's substance to Ben Johnson that's going to rub off on the rest of the team, because they didn't just bring him in to be the X's and O's guy. They brought him in to establish a culture when he just came from a place that went from bottom to top in the NFC North in a matter of a couple seasons. That takes more than just talented players. That takes more than just, the coach who can out-scheme other coaches. That takes somebody who knows what it's like to build something, to build a culture, and to sustain it no matter who comes in and out of your system. So for the first OTA being early, obviously all teams with new coaches get that. I imagine there will be a pretty intense message in that first team meeting for the guys who show up, because remember, they are voluntary. But I would imagine there's going to be pretty good attendance, especially when you have a new guy in the building that most of these players have not been around yet, they're going to want to hear what he has to say and what his message is and what is going to be expected of them throughout the offseason.
And then we'll get a feel for what Ben Johnson can do for these players and this team. We got to take a break. When we come back, we're going to make some predictions for this season and how likely some milestones may be. The Barometer is coming up right after the break.